So today we are going to be talking about something that I haven't really spoken about on this channel a whole lot, and that is my experience working as a zookeeper. So despite having an entire YouTube channel just completely dedicated to animals, I have not really spoken much before about my experience working as a zookeeper slash wildlife educator. And you know, with this being an animal channel, I know that there's a lot of people who watch my channel that might be interested in similar careers, who would be interested in hearing my experience, or maybe people who have absolutely no interest in it at all and just still want to hear my experience anyways. So yeah, that is like a quick little rundown of what I'm going to be doing in today's video. I'm going to be telling you guys all about my job and my experience that I had, and answering some of your questions. So a while ago, this was actually like a few months ago, I went on Instagram and I asked you all for some questions about being a zookeeper or just about my job and stuff, and you guys sent me a lot of really good questions. So at the end of this video, I'm going to go over that. So now that all of that is out of the way, let's just go ahead and dive right into the world of zookeeping. So I'm going to start off by just telling you what my job positions exactly were, because in the zoo world, the term zookeeper can really be a very broad term to just describe really any of the zoo's employees who somehow work with the animals. But obviously a lot of zookeepers have different jobs and specific positions. So I actually did quite a few different things at the zoo that I worked at, but my primary position was being a wildlife educator. So I didn't do a whole lot of animal care. I did do some, we'll talk about that in a bit, but I was mostly the person who was, you know, taking animals to birthday parties and events and doing like presentations with them. I'm sure a lot of you guys watching this video have probably had those types of birthday parties when you were a kid, where, you know, you have someone with a few different animals come and show the animals off and teach you about them. That is what I was doing for the most part. So doing the shows that I did, you are directly working with a wide variety of animals. We had a whole group of animals that we used for our outreach program. These animals mainly consisted of small reptiles, you know, a lot of like geckos, lizards, snakes, and stuff like that. We had a lot of turtles and tortoises, both smaller and large. And then we would also use some animals like big snakes, like reticulated pythons, anacondas. We would also use Cuvier's dwarf caimans frequently in the shows, sometimes animals like skunks and owls. So yeah, there was a wide variety of animals that I was using in these shows. So while I was working like directly with a lot of these animals, I wasn't responsible for a lot of their care and stuff, you know. I would go to the zoo, I would pack up my animals for my shows, and then I would head out and I would do my shows. I'd go back to the zoo, put the animals away, and that was about it. So in that section of my job, you know, it wasn't a whole lot of animal care. I wasn't like feeding animals, I wasn't cleaning their enclosures or anything like that. I was basically just educating the public. So that was a part of my job. However, there was a lot more to it. So as I mentioned, I did also do some animal care. So the animal care that I didn't really start until the beginning of this pandemic last March. Like I said, I was mainly a presenter. I wasn't doing a whole lot of animal care before, but when the pandemic started, you know, we were no longer able to do things like birthday parties and public shows and stuff like that. So when the pandemic started, I started doing some animal care. So when it came to the animal care that I did, I was mostly doing feedings and cleanings. So most of the feedings that I was doing were just for like the smaller animals, a lot of the smaller reptiles. So I would go and feed things like crickets and superworms and all of that to all of our insectivores, and then I would also prepare salads for a lot of our herbivores or omnivores. And now it wasn't just reptiles that I was preparing these meals for, I was also feeding animals like birds of prey. We had owls, vultures, all that, so I was feeding those animals as well. And then I was also having to prepare food for mammals like skunks and lemurs and sloths and bats bats. So yeah, there were a wide variety of animals that I was now helping in their care with things like preparing their foods, feeding them, and cleaning their enclosures. Then another thing that I did that is sort of unrelated, you know, I'm not going to be talking about this a whole lot in the video, was I was also managing the zoo's social media for a while. So I was the person who was answering all of their Facebook messages. I was promoting all of the events and stuff on Facebook. So yeah, I was not only like a zookeeper with the animals and stuff, but I was also their social media person. But again, I'm not really going to talk about that in this video. We're going to be talking about the actual like zookeeper aspect of the job. And then the last thing that I did at my job that kind of ties in with the like presenter educator position was that I gave private tours of the zoo. So again, this was something that we only started doing after the pandemic because, you know, as we had restrictions come up, we were no longer to just be open to the public like we used to be, but we were able to do things like private tours for individual groups. So I was also kind of a tour guide for a little bit. So yeah, as you can see, I have done quite a few different things at the zoo that I worked at. So even though I only worked there for like a year, I do feel like I have quite a broad experience. So now that you have an idea of what my job kind of was, let's talk about my actual experience working in a zoo. So the zoo that I worked at isn't like one of those big, massive outdoor zoos that you are probably thinking of, but instead it's a smaller indoor facility. And the facility that I worked at primarily specializes in like reptiles. So there are some mammals there. Like I said, I was helping care for things like sloths and lemurs and bats and skunks, but it was mostly reptiles. We didn't have a whole lot of larger animals or anything like that. And then the facility that I worked for was also a CASA accredited facility. So my experience that I'm talking about is the experience of someone who worked at a smaller, mostly indoor CASA accredited facility. So obviously, if you're working in some other type of zoo, your experience could be entirely different from mine. So overall, I absolutely loved my job as a zookeeper. I loved working with the animals. I loved getting to talk to people and educate people. I think that that was probably one of my favorite things about the job was, you know, doing shows and actually getting to teach people things and show kids how cool these animals are and that you don't need to be afraid of them. That was definitely one of my favorite things, which is so funny to me because growing up my whole life, I never wanted to work with kids. And I have never been a fan of public speaking. You know, I never ever saw myself in a job where I would be public speaking or working with kids. And then I ended up in a job that was basically literally just public speaking to children for the most part. It was a lot of public speaking to kids and I really enjoyed it. So my experience doing the shows and presentations for the most part was always really positive. Like I said, I always loved going and doing them, whether it was a school or a birthday party or whatever. It was just such a great, rewarding experience. For the most part, all of the kids are usually really interested in what you're talking about, and not even necessarily kids. I did birthday parties for adults and stuff too, but typically the people are always really interested in what you're talking about, and you can tell that they love learning as well. So when it came to actually doing these shows and stuff, the process was pretty simple. So I would go into the zoo, I would pack up the animals that I need to take for the show that I'm doing. So I would go and get all the animals ready, load them up in my car, and then I would drive to the house or the school or wherever I was going. I would go and do an hour-long show, and then I would either go back to the zoo or I would go to my next show. And then when it comes to the animal care, like I said, I obviously enjoyed that as well. So the animal care that I did was mainly feedings and cleanings. So a lot of the feedings that I did were for our smaller reptiles and stuff. So it was just a lot of like crickets and superworms and hornworms and whatnot, you know, your typical like pet reptile feeders. But then I would also also have to do things like thaw out rodents for our snakes and the birds of prey. And then we would also prepare meals for the animals like the lemurs and the sloths and the bats who had a little bit more of specialized diet. And then the best part of all, the cleaning. So yeah, there is a lot of cleaning involved when you are working with hundreds of animals. The cleaning is every single day. Like every single day you would go in there and you would spot clean enclosures or fully clean enclosures. You know, there is never a day where you are not doing a lot of cleaning. And most of that cleaning is really gross stuff. You're cleaning up a lot of big animal poop, you're cleaning up a lot of urates, and sometimes you're even cleaning up things like dead rodents. On multiple occasions, I cleaned the birds of prey enclosure. One of the birds that we had was a turkey vulture. Turkey vultures are absolutely disgusting when they eat, and they like to leave dead rodent pieces all around. So every single day I would go around and clean up a lot of enclosures, including some really nasty bird enclosures and some really gross snake poops and things like that. So yeah, the cleaning is definitely not that fun, but it is a very essential part of the job. So if it is something that you are considering, then be prepared to probably do some gross cleaning. So my overall thoughts on the job and stuff itself was that it was really fun. You know, it was right up my alley. It was definitely what I wanted to be doing. I really enjoyed working with the animals and working with people. However, there are also, unfortunately, quite a lot of downsides to the zookeeping industry. And I do want to say, I don't know what the zoo industry is like across the world. I'm mainly speaking on North America, but the zoo industry is very competitive in the sense that a lot of people want to do this job. You know, a lot of people want to work with animals, a lot of people want to be zookeepers. So because of that, it is a very competitive job. And unfortunately, competitive jobs often come with a lot of downside. Because zookeeping is such a competitive field and they know that there are people who want to do this job no matter what, there's not a lot of money to be made in the zoo industry, and there are a lot of sacrifices that sometimes come with it. You know, there are days where you're working for 13 hours straight, and the job also involves a lot of physical labor. I think that might be an aspect that gets overlooked. People don't realize how physically exhausting it can be to work with these animals and their very large enclosures. It can be a lot of physical work, and there have been days where I was working for 13 hours straight, and yeah, it is a very rewarding job, but it is a very exhausting job. Zookeeping is very much one of those passion jobs. No one really goes into zookeeping expecting to make a lot of money or anything like that. People do it because they love the animals and want to work with the animals. So yeah, while I do absolutely love the job that I have, you know, like I said, I loved working with the animals and I loved working around people, there are unfortunately some drawbacks to it, such as, you know, not a whole lot of money to be made, and there's a lot of physical labor involved, and sometimes a lot of long hours, very long days involved in this job. So that is always something you have to consider as well. Alright, so now that I've talked a little bit about my job and my experience, I want to go ahead and go through some of the questions that you asked me. So I'm going to pull up my phone here. I have the questions all saved on here. So let's go ahead and take a look. Alright, so one question I got a lot was basically just asking me if I went to school, what kind of schooling you need, do you need schooling, stuff like that. So let's talk about school. So when it comes to zookeeping, as I mentioned, it is a very competitive field. Because of that, having some sort of education in the subject will very greatly benefit you. However, it is not technically a requirement. There is no degree out there that makes someone a zookeeper. You know, you can get a zoology degree and be a zoologist, you can get a biology degree and be a biologist, and with those degrees you can also become a zookeeper, but there is no such thing as a single degree out there that just makes someone a zookeeper? So the short answer is no, you don't technically need a secondary education, but it will benefit you. In order to get a job in the zoo industry, you either really want to have a good education to back you up, or you need to have a lot of experience and possibly connections. Those are your three main things that are going to help you get a zoo job: is education, experience, and connections. I personally did not go to university or anything. I don't have any sort of special degree. I was able to get my job at the zoo, again, basically through experience and through connections. And now when it comes to experience for a zoo-related job, it doesn't have to be with exotic animals. Even just experience working with animals like dogs and cats or even farm animals puts you so far ahead of a lot of people. So the more animal experience you can get, whatever it may be, is going to benefit you when it comes to getting a zoo job. And if you make connections in the industry, reach out to people, build friendships and stuff like that, that is also going to go a very long way. And then on top of that, if you also want to go to school, that is also going to go a very long way. So to sum it up, no, you do not technically need a degree, but it will definitely benefit you and probably make finding a job easier. A lot of people wanted to know what, just my favorite animal that I worked with was, as well as my least favorite. So as far as my favorite animals go, I would probably say my favorite animals to work with were the birds of prey or the ringtail lemurs. Those were two of my just like absolute favorites. If I had to pick a least favorite out of the animals that I regularly worked with, it would probably just be the large snakes. And now again, I'm not scared of big snakes. I don't really have any problem with big snakes or anything. I just don't really enjoy working with them and like caring for them because their poops are really gross. Cleaning their enclosures is really gross. I don't like cleaning the big snakes' enclosures, and handling them is pretty difficult. At the zoo that I worked with, we had a protocol where, snakes over 10 feet like needed more than one person handling them. But yeah, I just don't really like working with the big snakes. They're kind of annoying to deal with, if I'm being honest. Again, I'm not saying they're bad animals or anything. I just don't like having to clean up after them and move them. A couple people asked me what my worst animal injury was, and I wish I had some sort of cool story for this, but I have absolutely nothing. The worst animal injury I got working at the zoo was probably like this tiny little scratch I got on my arm. I have no idea if you can even see the scar, but there's a very, very, very slight scar on my arm that I got from a green iguana on one of my very first training shifts. So let's talk about this fun story. So when I first started at the zoo and I was being trained by Josh, who is now my boyfriend, Josh was training me on doing shows and outreach, and we had a green iguana with us. It was my job to hold the animal while he talked and presented it. So I was holding this green iguana. This green iguana was covered in poop. So like I said, we were doing a show and the iguana had pooped in its bin on our way to the show and just ran all in its poop. Fun fact, if you're a zookeeper, poop can't bother you at all. You have to pretend like it doesn't exist. So I still took this iguana out, covered in poop, was holding it to show these kids, even though there was poop all over its foot. And it scratched me on the arm here. It was a very, very small scratch, but it scratched me with its poop covered foot, so it got quite infected and was not a very nice looking wound and left a little bit of a scar. So yes, I have a fun little scar to remind me of when Josh, my boyfriend, and I first met and started working together. I have a lovely iguana poop reminder of that. So this was an interesting question I got. Someone asked me if any of the animals at the zoo that I worked at ever came in poor condition or were just like unhealthy when we got them, and the answer to that is 1000% yes. And now that might sound a little sketchy until I explain things to you. The zoo that I worked at was Canada's largest exotic animal rescue. Most of the animals that we had at the zoo were all rescued in one way or another. Most of them were people's just like pets that they couldn't care for anymore, which is why we had so many like smaller reptiles, a lot of just like animals that you would know as pets like leopard geckos, corn snakes, ball pythons. So yeah, we had a lot of animals that used to just be people's pets at one point. And then some of our other animals were situations like they were wild animals that were injured and then couldn't be released. For example, one of the turkey vultures we had, she was a wild turkey vulture, but years ago she was hit by a car and was never able to like fly after that. So because of that, she wouldn't survive in the wild. So now she has been living at the zoo. So yeah, a lot of the animals that I worked with came in bad conditions and were rehabilitated back to health. So yeah, the place that I worked definitely did have, unfortunately, a lot of animals come in poor conditions, but thankfully they were able to receive better care after that. Alright, and this is the last question I'm going to answer. A lot of the other questions I got were answered like just earlier in the video while I was talking about my job and experience, so this is going to be the last one, and this question was just, were there any animals that you were scared or like nervous to work with at first? And again, the answer to this is definitely yes. So even before working at the zoo, I had a lot of previous animal experience, so you know, I wasn't just like a total newbie to animals or anything, but there were quite a few animals at the zoo that I had never worked with before that I was a little bit intimidated by. For example, the crocodilians are probably the first one that comes to mind. I worked very closely with the caimans that we had, but I never worked really with any of the bigger ones. So we did have alligators, we did have crocodiles, we had things like American alligators, there were dwarf crocs, there were Nile crocs, there were, yeah, lots of different crocodilians, and then as I mentioned, there were also the dwarf caimans. I worked with the dwarf caimans a lot. I used them on shows all the time, so I was very comfortable with handling the caimans after a while, but when I first started, I was really nervous about that because I had never handled anything like that, you know? Learning how to properly handle crocodilians was entirely new to me, and I was definitely very nervous about it at first, which I think is definitely understandable. You probably should be a little bit nervous of crocodilians, so yeah, I would say just the crocodilians were the main one that comes to mind. Big snakes a little bit, just because I had never really worked with big snakes before. You know, I've seen big snakes plenty, you know, I have a lot of smaller snakes, but I had never worked with big snakes, so I wasn't super familiar on how to properly handle them or anything. You know, these are things that I had to learn on the job. But to answer the question, yes, there were definitely a couple animals that I was a little bit intimidated of at first until I became a bit more comfortable with them. Alright, that video was a lot of talking, so I am going to go ahead and end it here. Thank you all so much for watching. I do really appreciate it, and I hope that some of you guys enjoyed watching this and were hopefully able to get some helpful insight out of it. If you did enjoy this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a big thumbs up, and also be sure to subscribe to my channel. I post a lot of videos about animals, so you don't want to miss those, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Also be sure to check out all of my social media. I would love to have you guys over on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok. You know, I have a lot of fun on those apps, so be sure to check out my profile if you do have those apps. So make sure you check all those out. It will be all down in the description below, but everything is basically just EmmaSam99. With all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. Thank you all so much for watching. I do really appreciate it, and I will see you all in my next video.